Our next speaker is Lee Loftus. He has extensive governance experience as a labor leader with the BC Federation of Labor, Building Trades, Insulators Union. He's currently the Vice Chair of WorkSafe BC. Welcome, Lee, to our ADAO conference.
Thank you, Ellen. Now, Lee, we're going to flip you onto the camera so that we can see you and have a great conversation. You're an important man that represents important unions and industries and movements. Please, for the viewers today, introduce yourself, and if you feel comfortable, share a little bit about your personal story as to why the asbestos ban movement matters to you.
Well, first, thank you very much. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be involved in your program today. And a little bit about me that provides the audience some background. So I'm a third generation asbestos worker, insulator tradesperson. So my grandfather, my father, and myself have followed down the lines of being involved in the construction industry and in both the application and fabrication and installation and removal of asbestos-containing materials. So that sort of really allows me to have a good understanding. As I remember asbestos coming in the back door of my house as a young child, and my father particularly sprayed asbestos in industrial and commercial institutional environments. So he had this big head of curly hair, and he'd come home and onto the back porch at the end of the day. It wasn't uncommon for him to be covered in asbestos fibers, and for Kafko insulation is what he was spraying. And he'd pat his clothes off and shake his hair and pick up the kids and walk in the back door and off into his bedroom and shed his clothing and take it down to the laundry just to have it done in the house. So asbestos isn't something that I'm not unfamiliar with. I followed a little bit in his footsteps. I followed a lot in his footsteps, as a matter of fact, in regards to the awareness around asbestos and what asbestos means to working people and families, partners and spouses. And we'll have a bit of a presentation, and I'll save a bit of that stuff for you. But I've been an active member, or I've been an active advocate for over 4 decades, championing the issue around asbestos, helping workers' compensation claims, participating in the bans, and assisting in the development and institution of regulations and enforcement of asbestos rules on the west coast of British Columbia, and particularly in Canada. So that's a brief introduction to some of my work, and I've worked with many, many people, including Linda in the past and others, in conversations around the ban of asbestos in North America.
Thank you, Lee. I'm glad you shared your story, because that was much richer than what we could have put together. I appreciate your honesty about your 3 decades of family experience in the Insulator Union. So Lee is here today to talk about art, but before we open the PowerPoint, I want to just set the stage, Lee, for people who don't know, and I think that unions are reemerging even stronger than ever. It was the unions in the late 20s that identified their workers with exposure and disease. Unions have always come to the front of the line to help ADAO and others, whether it's Insulator Union, building trades, firefighters. If you don't have the support from the unions, it is very hard to move anything. Lee, as a union man or member, can you just tell our audience how and why unions are important?
Geez, I don't know where to start with that. I mean, I think that being a member of the Insulators and Asbestos Workers gave me the opportunity back in 1982 to meet Dr. Selikoff, and Dr. Selikoff's work was instrumental to some of the work and the awareness that we did in North America. If you take a look at his publications that were produced back in the early 70s, that became the root document in regards to that. But the insight of that goes further to the 70s. It goes into the 60s when the labor movement engaged epidemiologists and other medical people to come back and give us the details. And you know, the details around asbestos exposure, and the disease associated to it, and though it was classified like a silicosis, asbestosis concern, it was far more troubling when it started to take a look at the cancers and the cancer rates and the death rates associated to that. So, you know, it was really crucial that the labor movement did this, because we know for a fact that the documentations we secured in doing that research, that the scientists and the medical professionals for the business community, for the manufacturers, for the mining companies, already had that same information going back into the early 40s. And we have evidence, and hard evidence, in 1947 of documentation that said asbestos exposure will elevate the risk to cancer. Asbestos exposure will cause asbestosis, identical to silicosis, and asbestos exposure should be avoided. So, you know, those are the documents that were pulled from some archives and some from files, and the labor movement in North America has championed that. And that work with Selikoff and the development of that led to the changes to regulatory regime across North America. We saw the changes here in British Columbia in 1978. We saw the championing further of the restrictions putting in place in the workplaces in the very early 80s. And, you know, ultimately we had controls in place and awareness in place. Not necessarily successful, not evenly enforced, but in place by the early 80s, that some of those exposures from the past were being less. That doesn't make it safe, it just makes it less. And that compensations were being paid for spouses and widows and victims of asbestos, and their claims were being accepted in the compensation system throughout North America. Many of the jurisdictions in North America have presumptions attached. So if you come down with mesothelioma, asbestosis, oral plaques, carcinogenic carcinoma, and you have evidence that you were working with or exposed to asbestos, it is presumed that your medical condition is compensable and paid sometimes all the way through pensions to death, but certainly until death for healthcare and other issues and death benefits.
Well,
So the labor movement has been crucial in making sure those pieces are in place in North America.
we're grateful to what labor has done both in the U.S. and around the world. But Lee has a really exciting art project to share with you today. And I think it's going to blend the fact that he knows very well through his family and his work about the horrors of asbestos and the diseases caused. But he also wants to do something for the future. That's how I view this.
All right, so first I want to acknowledge that the BC Labor Heritage Center is a key component in regards to putting this project together. And the BC Labor Heritage Center is an organization that comes from the labor movement in British Columbia that captures the history, the challenges, and whether they're little or small or minor or big events that have happened here in BC, we want to make sure that they're available for future generations. And we do a lot of awareness around strikes and catastrophes and train wrecks and mining accidents, and we do plaques around the province, and this project fits. It just fits with what the labor movement knows, and so they were the lead in regards to this. I also want to acknowledge WorkSafe BC. WorkSafe BC is the Workers' Compensation Board in the province of British Columbia. They're the regulator and the enforcement and the insurance company around workplace issues. They were also one of the key contributors to the front end of this project. They provided 50% of the total funding just about, and provided the seed funding for us to make sure that this happened. I also want to acknowledge the province of British Columbia. The province of British Columbia and the government through the Ministry of Tourism, Arts, Culture and Sports provided us the end funding we needed to get this done. Fundraising during a pandemic is not fun, and I know that the ADAO understands fundraising during pandemics. It's a challenge and it's a problem. But I also want to acknowledge PAVCO, and PAVCO is actually the business name for the BC Convention Center. And this convention center has a unique program. It has an art program to share labor heritage. And I'll talk a little bit of a slide later on in regards to that, because, you know, the convention center in downtown Vancouver is committed to making sure that there's art in place and it reflects labor. So if we move to the next slide, we can take a look at this picture. And this picture is a little bit about the labor movement in the history. This picture was taken in 1971. It is the first wildcat strike of workers in Canada due to asbestos exposure and asbestos in the workplace. This was taken during the construction of the Pacific Center in downtown Vancouver. And if you look at the top row, and on the left-hand side, the third person in, the third full worker in, that's my dad. And so my dad was on this job site, and his job was at the end of a spray gun spraying Cafco insulation, which was 70% chrysotile. And this job site went on strike because as they were spraying the structural steel and all of the ceilings and all of the walls, there was no windows in the building. And asbestos was laying everywhere. It was in the stairways, it was on the floorways, it was in the areas where they were eating their lunch. It was going out the windows, it was on the sidewalk, it was falling on the pedestrians, it was on the cars, and it was just a disaster. And it ties to that original conversation I had a minute ago in regards to the Selikoff documentation. You know, the preliminary documents were being circulated among the insulators and asbestos workers in 71, and this was, they knew then this was going to be a killer. So that's where this all started from. And you know, it's interesting that it's a half a century later, and we're still on that battle. We're still struggling with that. Though we've stopped mining, and though we've banned asbestos in Canada on December the 30th of 2018, we still haven't done inventories. We still haven't done the things that we need to do. And we still have more work to do, because certainly what's happening today in the demolition and the renovation industry is that it's virtually unregulated, monitored but unregulated, and we're still seeing piles of asbestos being dropped in laneways, in schoolyards, and in empty lots. We know that people are being exposed that shouldn't be. We know that it's not being disposed of properly. So, I mean, that's really about why we're trying to make some more awareness. If we move to the next slide, we wanted to capture a location. And the reason we captured this location is that this is the convention center, and they have an art program, but importantly, the location they provided us with is has foot traffic of 1 million tourists a year. And that's important for sharing this message. And it's right on the very corner of that building that juts out in front of us. If we move to the next slide, but it'll be helpful, because even more important with that location is that you see those piers all along there. These are all art pieces and plaques and designations. This is called the line of work. And you know, the far end coming towards us comes towards the water. And the line of work is a piece that that's about acknowledging and providing a place for us to go on the National Day of Mourning on April the 28th. We gather this as the labor movement and workers and employers and government and talk about the toll. So we have been able to secure at the very, very north end of this, closest to the water, a last piece of strip of land to install this piece of artwork that we undertook. If you go to the next slide, it talks about a little bit more of the location. And the next slide is that though you see across the waters the North Shore of the city of Vancouver, and naturally called North Vancouver, that used to be an all industrial work. all of that along there, if you go either to the left or the right, you'll still see the industrial settings. On the left, you'll see piles of sulfur and potash and coal. It's a deep sea harbor. And on the right, you'll see shipyards and some deep sea piers as well. The shipyards and those locations is where workers were exposed. And as you look to the North Shore or over to the north and towards the mountains, you'll see the shipyards where I spent a decade installing and repairing and fixing and then finally removing asbestos. But even, it is a reminder of workers and it's a reminder of the industrial setting. But even more importantly is that as you look a little bit more to the east, as you take a peek at that, there will be a number of piers, and those piers are the asbestos piers from Cassiar Asbestos. So the mining that was done in British Columbia was shipped down the west coast of Canada. On one or two of the vessels, the Klondike, the MV Klondike, would pull up to those piers and unload asbestos, and the longshore workers would be handling bales of asbestos and covered in asbestos and be floating into the neighborhoods. It was everywhere. And we took it out of those vessels and we put it into deep sea containers and vessels and we shipped it around the world to be used in other regions of the world which were probably less regulated than us. We ensured that our contamination was being shared worldwide. We ensured that our drama around the loss of life was being extended to other places. So this location for the artwork and recognition was very important. If we go to the next slide, we'll see the jury that was sent out the notice of call. Matter of fact, we're actually standing on the site. You'll see the line of work in behind us. But we're standing on the site where this art has been erected. But we put out a call to artists, and let me read what it says. The memorial will provide a visual monument to honor and commemorate the thousands of people who died from disease caused to the exposure of asbestos. The memorial, and this is the important part from my perspective, will also serve as a potential purpose for bringing public attention to the continued threat posed by the continuing presence of asbestos all around us. So we engaged with 4 local artists. They came back with a number of different proposals in regards to how they could capture that, what would it look like. There were interpretive walls, there was bronze statues, there was upright structures, and there was a kinetic piece that was attached and submitted. After a full day of presentations and submissions, if you go to the next slide, the jury selected Doug Taylor's kinetic proposal. The jury felt that the attraction and the story behind the design, along with the inscription written by poet John Gray, would fill the goals of awareness and prevention. So, as I said earlier, there's foot traffic of about 1 million people who go past this corner on an annual basis of tourism alone. This is a pretty unique piece, and people are going to be drawn to it just based on what it looks like and what it does and how it moves and all the pieces around that. And the inscription, I think, will help them understand. If you go to the next piece or next slide, you know, there's some interpretive plaques that are attached. And I'm sorry that I don't have a clean of this. This is during the installation about a month ago. But John Gray wrote this piece, and I want to read it to you. It's called Magic and Lethal. And it says, take a look across the inlet where asbestos was loaded for export. Workers hauled it, breathed it, took it home, later to die from it by the thousands. Asbestos was and is the magic mineral. Floors, walls, ceilings, roofing, oven mitts, hair dryers, crayons, talcum powder. Cheap, plentiful, and easy to mine, and lethal to breathe. This much was known in 1947. Once in the lungs, asbestos fibers stay there. A time bomb, one exposure, can bring on terminal cancer decades later when there's nobody left to blame. The reckoning must be begun. Asbestos exposure is already the largest on-the-job killer in Canada. More than 150,000 have already been exposed. Canada banned asbestos in 2018. You do the math. So that'll be an interesting piece at the bottom of the kinetic artwork that I think will attract the attention of many tourists and create some awareness. And people will walk away from that with second thoughts about what does that mean and why is it there. You know, I have some special feelings around the artwork. I'm not sure everybody will understand it the way I do, but if you play the video, I'll come back and have a little bit of comments in regards to what it means to me and why, one of the reasons it was selected. Let me explain the artwork when I saw it. It's a weather vane. And if you look at the weather vane, you'll see that the weather vane of the weather vane is in the shape of a pair of lungs. That, of course, attracted my attention. The structural piece that attaches the kinetic pieces on the left-hand side are shaped in a bronchial tube. And that catches my attention because I understand the lungs and I understand the bronchial tube. And then if you take a look at, and if you get a chance to see the moving pieces, you'll see that those are like bicycle wheels. And the bicycle wheels are laid out in a format that is just about identical to the molecule of asbestos. And they've done that on purpose because that's the molecule of asbestos. But they've also, on those bicycle wheels, attached cups, and the cups actually generate the motion of all of the wheels. And as I looked at that, I saw those cups on the end of these pieces, and I saw that, and it reminded me of the alveoli. And the alveoli, of course, is the very small pockets in the lungs that are very delicate, and they do the blood gas exchange, and they're the ones that get damaged due to scarring and asbestos fibers, and, you know, attack the lungs and make them non-functional. So I mean, that piece was very important to me. But I think even more important to me with my 10 years in the shipyard and working in the insulation department, or the lagging shop as they once called it, I would be cutting and shaping asbestos and ceramic fibers and fiberglasses. A lot of asbestos material I was managing, and you know, in that 2 o'clock time on a Sunday or on a Monday afternoon, the sunshine coming through the shop windows and shining through the other side, and if you looked into those rays of sun, you saw nothing but airborne fiber, and dense airborne fiber. And knowing that I was standing in that shop, that those fibers were attacking me and others and workers around me. So as you watch the spinning of those wheels and those cups and that molecule, and it just reminds me of the chaotic nature of what I would see in that cloud of dust in that insulation shop attacking the lungs. So, you know, there's the bronchial tube and there's the lungs and there's this chaotic mass. So that's how this art hits me. I'm not sure that that's going to hit the general public the way it hits me, but, you know, 50 years of being around asbestos, 50 years of knowing what it does, 50 years of watching people pass at their bedsides, doing the work that I've done in regards to the phone calls in the middle of the night because they're dying or they're not going to see their grandchildren, and 50 years of all of that type of stuff. This piece of work is pretty special to me. So really, that's my presentation I wanted to talk about. I wanted to thank Linda and all of her partners, not just Linda herself and not just the ADAO, but many, many people across North America that have continued to do this issue around banning asbestos, continue to do the awareness stuff. There are a number of us that are champions, and Linda and her team and the people that allowed us to make this presentation are certainly part of that. So thank you.
Lee, thank you. If we don't partner for prevention, we have let hundreds of thousands of people die in vain. So that's not an option for you, for me, for Fernanda, or for anyone else in this audience. Lee, you're having a dedication, I believe, for the memorial next week. Is that right?
Memorial, geez, I'm excited. 6 more days out, 10 o'clock in the morning, the Vancouver Convention Center, Vancouver, British Columbia. We are going to do the final unveiling and dedication. It will be, as we can understand, the first and only memorial for asbestos in North America. I'm not sure I'm proud of that. I'm a little disappointed that it's 2022 and there's nothing anywhere else. I know there's a park in Libby, Montana, but there is no place for family or workers or community to gather to acknowledge this. So if it has to be Vancouver, I guess I'm proud that it's going to take place.
Well, you're in a better position than we are. You stopped importing and using asbestos in 2018, and we're still letting hundreds of tons come in from Brazil, Russia, and China. So I'll stand in your corner any day. Will you tell the labor unions we need you? I know you have our back. It is important that we all partner for prevention for all workers and, of course, their families and our future. Lee, on behalf of ADAO, thank you for sharing the artwork, your personal story, and the picture of your father was quite telling. 1972-ish on the steps saying asbestos kills, and 50 years later we stand here today trying to raise awareness to prevent exposure to eliminate all diseases. Lee, dear friend, thank you so much. Good luck on the 20th.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity in the conference.